I wanted to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that reduces the risk and costs of cross-border transactions. As a board member, there are few better feelings than making a suggestion which adds quick material value to your organisation. I remember when one of our board members saved us $50,000 with a quick introduction to a group discount scheme for one of our key suppliers. I continue to feel grateful to this day. Alt21 can offer exactly this kind of quick win for board members. By using their foreign exchange and hedging services, you could reduce your company's costs by 90%. For a company that has just 10 million foreign exchange exposure through its revenues or cost base, that could be over 300,000 back into the business. Alt21 are so confident that they offer the best value in the market. They show you how much they make from fees in real time before and after any transaction. If you want to save your organization money on its foreign exchange and hedging, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Newroll. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Dorothy Burwell, is a partner at FGS Global, an international strategic communications and public affairs consultancy. Ned at Fortune 500 listed Post Holdings, a consumer packaged goods company, and FTSE 250 Pennon plc, a leading UK water and environmental infrastructure company, where she is a member of the Audit, Remuneration, ESG and Health and Safety Committees. Dorothy is also a trustee at the London chapter of the Links Incorporated, an international women's charity and NGO. Until recently, she was also a trustee at Which, the UK's leading consumer protection agency. Dorothy, a huge welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Ollie.
I should also say a special thanks to the wonderful Rory Campbell, who introduced us, having recommended you as a guest for an episode.
Yes, he's very kind and said wonderful things about you as well.
Dorothy, I would love to start, given your background and expertise on communications, by asking you, what have been the 3 experiences as a communications expert that have most shaped the way you think today as a board member about communications at the board level?
I think communicators or corporate affairs experts, as we often say, we're students of human behavior and decision making. So we're always looking at trends. We're thinking about what influences minds, what doesn't influence minds. And so when I think about your question, it's how do we take those skills and really apply that in the boardroom, either within the room itself or with the decisions that we're making that are going to impact things outside? I would pick out 3 experiences. The first one would be when I joined our global partnership board at FGS. That was following a 3-way merger, which then turned into a big acquisition. So it felt basically like merging 4 big businesses all together. And my role as a member of the management board was thinking about how we were actually going to bring all those brands together and come up with one unified identity that 4 founder-led organizations could all get around. So that was quite complex and it's a really good learning experience. And I've taken that into the next board I went on, which was the Consumers Association. And in that particular one, most people don't realize that Which is a charity and a for-profit business. So there's a hybrid commercial charitable model, which you can imagine has its own complexities itself because you've got to think about for-profit aims, but at the same time also think about the public good and how do you make decisions when they don't necessarily marry up those 2 aims. And then the last thing is I went on to a for-profit board, my first for-profit board. So I was going from the consumer protection side to actually needing to sell the widgets to the public. And what are the differences between the 2 of those? And what's the difference between what I learned in the UK corporate governance perspective and going into the US, where it's a very different dynamic between the board and the CEO?
I'd love to start with that experience at FGS, which sounds amazing. And the idea of bringing 4 founder-led businesses together and getting a single vision that they could get behind makes my mind boggle and sometimes struggle with just the idea of doing 2. Talk me through what were the key pain points and how you actually went about doing that successfully.
Yeah, well, as a founder yourself, I'm sure you can relate to people feeling very wed to their role as the sole decision maker or one of two or three co-founding decision makers and everything laddering up to their vision of what the world looks like. So you imagine you bring all these people in a room and you quickly realize actually the job that you were given is not the job that you're actually doing. It didn't really matter what color the paint was on the wall. It didn't really matter what letters we were putting into the ultimate brand. What I was really helping people do was learn how to make decisions in a really brand new way to them. How do you surface opinion? How do you create psychological safety so everybody feels like they can actually bring their true opinions to the fore? How do you learn to disagree? And when you do disagree, how do you learn to disagree and commit so you can still move forward and get to an ultimate goal? So those are the things I was wrestling with. And you see it with clients when you're an advisor like me, but it's very different when you're in it and you actually have to live with the decision at the end of the day. So I think for me, it was really learning how to listen and also get under the skin of an organization to understand what the unwritten group dynamics are and what makes them feel proud, how to reflect back to each of those individuals so they feel heard, how to use an empathetic communication style, but still show that you're being impartial in your approach. Because if you're too overly cuddly with any one individual person, then the rest of them think that the process is a sham. So you need to make sure that everybody feels like they've got an equal part to play in coming to the ultimate decision at the end. So that was something that I think is really useful when you go and think about the boardroom, because your ability to affect change is still all about influence. I'm not an executive when I'm in the boardroom. I'm not actually signing the checks. I'm not actually making all the decisions day to day. So how do you take that and grow the management team so that they can actually get to those aims as well?
Just thinking, for a board member listening to this whose organization might be about to go through a merger, thinking, gosh, Dorothy, your experience is really interesting here. I'd love to get some lessons for this on, what advice can I give to our CEO and executive team to think about how they go through this. You said you bring them all together into a room, and I could imagine bringing 4 founders into a room and it being an absolute disaster as they all have their different views of the world and get irritated with each other and disappear off in different directions. I'm interested to understand, what were the practicalities of how you went about that a board member listening might be able to share with their exec?
Yeah. So one, I didn't do it by myself. I made sure to get some outside counsel in to be another independent arbiter because, fundamentally I was from one of the organizations too. So you need to make sure that they can see that you're not just relying on what you know and what you've experienced. So we constructed a process where we had our outside advisor who walked us through, this is what a brand process looks like. Let's make sure we get some data about what you've told us, what you believe about your organizations. Let's go outside and see what other people believe about your organization. So they had something independent that they could react to and say, okay, well, if this is what people believe, then this is what I think we should do. Think about, how would I have advised a client now that I have this information and I take the names off the piece of paper, so to speak, and say, okay, if I'm just given A, B, and C, and this is what I've been told the beliefs are, what do I actually think the outcome should be? And I think that helped people a lot. I think the other thing was you also find out, because people always come into the room with what is their end game. I've got one thing that I want to do, or one piece of the argument that I want to win. You need to give people an opportunity to take a step back and feel like they're co-creating something that isn't that specific goal. So I think that was probably a breakthrough moment for us. We all came together in New York. There were 30 people in the room. My nerves were in tatters at the beginning, but they came together as we went along, because what you saw happen in the room when you asked people big picture questions about the future and their vision, there was actually a lot more commonality than they had ever discovered in any of their pre-discussions before we actually got together in the merger. So it actually helped people say, oh, you know what? I believe that we can get there too. I'm excited about this thing that doesn't currently exist too. So it gave people a new starting point, and having that new starting point that they could all rally around really made them feel more like, okay, we are all co-founding something together, as opposed to just bringing together bits and pieces.
Wow, 30 people in a room. I'm a big advocate of the 2 pizza teams, unless you're doing a sort of an inform piece. How on earth do you get 30 people with strong opinions practically co-creating something of value?
So with 30 people in the room, obviously everybody wasn't coalesced around one whiteboard. You broke people down into different problems to solve. And so by doing that, we broke people into 4 groups and then had each of the 4 groups report back on what they thought about the different problems that they needed to solve around brand, identity, market entry, all of those things. And that helped people say, okay, I actually like what this group came up with. You weren't surfacing one answer. You were surfacing all of the ideas for people to react to. And then you take it away with the 2 pizza team and you try to distill it down. But if everyone doesn't feel like they've actually been able to input, then you don't have ambassadors for the decision at the end. So it's really important that you go through the process in order to make sure that the team itself isn't going out and saying, actually, that discussion was great, but I don't want to be associated with it. I'm just going to go back and do my own thing.
So did you mix the 4 organizations up across those teams?
Yes, of course. So you made sure that you had all of the squeaky wheels spread across the different groups. That way you're not having one group that's dominated by one particular set of voices.
And how did you think about timing? Because I guess one of the risks when you go through a merger like that is the whole thing blows up on you. And I think there's sometimes a temptation to say, well, let's first do the announcement and say there's going to be no change initially while we bed it in, and then give yourself time to do it, versus the mindset which says 100-day planning, let's go from day one and use the impetus that we have of the transaction to affect change. How did you think about that?
We took our time. So we knew that we couldn't rush it. So when the transaction was announced and the transaction was closed, we didn't change the name on the door on day one. We took the time to let the team get together and really understand where they were going so that there wasn't a change and then another change. In an organization that is fundamentally a people business, everybody feels like, and they, which were also small people businesses, every single partner feels like they have, and they practically do have, an ownership stake in the business. So you don't want anyone to feel like their opinions or feelings were roughshod. You want to go through something that allows you to take the fish, put it into water in the bag, and then open the bag after they've gotten comfortable so they can get out and swim. It's sort of that process.
Okay. And you had multiple stakeholders there. You've got your internal employees, you've got your clients, as well as shareholders. How did you think about sequencing the messaging across them? Was that contemporaneous, or were you prioritizing one ahead of the others?
You started internal and then went external. So you start with the internal, because if you can't work together, then it doesn't really matter what the shareholders think. The shareholders are going to lose money because we're not working together well. So we started internally. We also wanted to involve our people over time. So there were opportunities for us to look at beyond the senior management team, looking at the wider organization as well, and making sure that they are all introduced to the concept beforehand. But we basically went through a sequence with the top tier management team, got to a decision. You source a little bit of opinion from throughout the organization. And then once you've gotten to a place, you're keeping the shareholders abreast of where you are in the process throughout that period, so that when you get to the ultimate decision, they're confident that you've actually surfaced all of the issues and that they are not going to have to intervene, or they're not going to be surprised later on.
And so now, as a board member, if you learn an organization that you're sitting on the board of is about to go through a merger, what is top of mind for you? What are the questions that you're asking? What's the advice that you're giving to that executive team?
Yeah. They mostly center around culture, because those are the things that you can't figure out when you're writing an SPA. So you have to really get in and sit with people for quite a long time to really understand what the behaviors are, whether or not you actually think a culture is good or bad. Lots of different cultures make money, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they blend together well. And so that's where I would focus most of my time, is getting out into the business and getting to know people.
How do you do that, though, before you have agreed terms and a transaction? One of my experiences is, obviously, as an investor, you're a little bit on the outside and so it's chicken and egg. You can't understand the culture until you've committed.
Yeah. So what I've seen done by an investor is actually getting out and meeting people who have recently worked in the business, because they will be the people who know the culture the best. Hopefully people who left on good terms, because you want to get a more impartial view of what the business is like. And so if it's a business that's been around not for 5 years, but 15 or 20, you will be able to actually go out in the market and be able to find out things about that and what works well and what doesn't, and what people have taken with them as good memories. Those are some of the ways that investors go about it. It is difficult when you are the principal in the business to be able to do do that, but it's one of the outside-in ways you can do it.
I think one of the ways I would probably think about it now is I would look for people's people analytics, because even actually if you're being hired by someone, you're always taking a bit of a leap of faith. They can explain the culture to you, you can meet everybody, but until you're actually in there living it day to day, it's very hard to feel it. But I do think actually people analytics, if people have that data, can be a really powerful source of insight into how an organization is working. Is that something that you would rely on?
To an extent. So I have probably a slightly controversial view around people analytics, and that I do think there is an element of fear of discoverability when people fill in surveys, internal surveys in particular, so that it's a bit difficult. And then if you look at Glassdoor, a lot of times it may be dominated either by people who have been asked to fill it in or people who have left. And so therefore they have a negative motivation for why they want to write something on Glassdoor. So I think it's a little bit more difficult to figure out. I've heard of some other technologies that actually look at more at behavior analytics, where you actually look at how people have conversations with each other in a business. I think that's probably a lot more telling and a lot more interesting than what people do when they pick strongly agree or strongly disagree on a survey.
Can we talk about your witch experience?
Yeah,
sure. One of the interesting things there was that commercial non-profit liminality. Tell me a bit more about the lessons that you took from that experience and how they have shaped how you think today as a board member about communications.
Yeah. So just to take a step back, there's 3 elements to this structure that I found interesting. One is a commercial entity in an industry that was changing rapidly. It's a publishing business. Obviously, publishing in the last 20 years has been turned completely on its head with the advent of the internet and the popularization of social media. Then you have the charitable portion of the business, which is trying to safeguard the interests of a wide spread of people, from the elderly to the vulnerable and the general population. And then it's a membership organization. So it's not just a charity. It's got people whose parents were members and they've become members and they hope their children will be members of this organization. So the sense of ownership is even greater than someone who's just generally a volunteer or supportive of consumer rights as a whole. So when you try to put all those things together, you can imagine as a management team, you are seriously doing the splits at trying to serve various different masters. I've got one board over here saying this is what you need to do to involve your business proposition and make sure that you're able to compete with upstarts like a money supermarket or a money saving expert. And then you've got people over here saying, well, if we lean into this digital proposition too hard, what about all the people who don't have digital access? How are we protecting them? So there's a wide spread of things that they have to do. I think when you have that, no matter how much you like the individuals, there's a certain seed of mistrust because you don't understand motivations. And so you don't understand how people are coming at and coming to decisions or recommendations. And in so far as that happens, it's incumbent on every member of the board to really reflect on how they can make the discussions more productive. So for me, coming in, partway through that journey, I had to think about how do I get the trust of the management team, because I want to have productive discussions with them. I want to really understand what the real problems are, not the perfect little deck that they put together to try to get us to sign off. And then when there is something that needs to get decided, and for me, I was brought on as a strategic communications and brand expert. And one of the things that we were thinking about was how do we evolve the brand to make it more modern and make sure it's resonating with the consumers of today? So what are the decision points that are really important here that are going to help get us over the line and not have people just kind of locking horns or coming to an impasse and not allowing us to move forward? And when do you actually make your voice heard? You can't speak up constantly because eventually people start to ignore you. So when do you use your voice and when do you come with evidence so that you can substantiate a point and perhaps back up a member of the management team who's struggling to get something over the line? So, it was really the art of negotiation while trying to maintain kind of good relations with everyone.
Talk to me more about that, how you build trust with the management team as a board member, because I think that gets to the heart of so much of a board member's ability to add value.
Yeah. So one, needing to spend some time with management outside of the board meetings. And I don't mean meddling and asking loads of questions, because sometimes people think that's what it is. I need to have a one-on-one where I can interrogate you. And that really wasn't what it was. It was, okay, let's talk about what's the thing that's bothering you right now, and let's just talk it through. Let's set aside 30 minutes. Let me come over to you for a coffee and really hear it out and try to see if I can input into a discussion with you and a member of your team and talk to you about a specific situation. I was lucky. I really got on with their brand and sustainability director, and we were able to have one-on-one discussions before we got to the board meeting so that I understood where he was coming from, what kind of research he did. I was able to impart things that I'd learned from my recent experience. And that helped with him thinking about how he was going to frame his points coming into the board meeting. So, and also helping him understand, okay, well, these are the questions that I would have if I were a board member with this sort of point of view. Because as I say, we're all students of human behavior. And so if you can tackle these questions, that will help you in making your argument and making sure other people can get comfortable. And in doing that and helping them, that actually meant that they trusted that I had the intention of making them better, not just trying to catch them out.
You touched on the third example there of your experiences of different cultures, having sat on both a US and a UK board. Really interested to hear what board members listening can learn from that.
Yeah. So it's not just those two boards as well. I think it's also advising companies whose boards sit in different countries and listening to the types of questions that we get from those people who are either sitting in those boardrooms or reporting to those boards. Many people will probably have told you this on prior podcasts. In the US, the CEO has a lot more power. A lot of times they're even the chair. So that's going to set up a completely different dynamic. Also in the boardroom, you don't have the same corporate governance code where the board is in charge and expected to own the strategy. In Europe, in the UK, that's the expectation. So the level of involvement is going to be that much greater. We have more meetings in the UK than you do in the US. In the US, I have 4 meetings and ad hoc calls. In the UK, I have 6 meetings. Many of them are multiple days. So there's a lot more time that's spent because we're much more deeply involved in helping the management team with fleshing out the strategy and making sure we've kicked the tires. So that's one piece. I think also when you speak up in the room, and you're thinking about the dynamic and what I've observed and how we speak with the CEO in the UK and how people approach discussions with the CEO, I think it's much more the board is actually working with the CEO and trying to push the CEO in a certain direction. In the UK versus in the US, I think a lot of times the CEO has already gone around and figured out what all of the board members want or what their opinions are going to be so that when they get to the meeting, we basically got a done deal. Neither one is wrong, right? It's the way that the societies are set up, but you kind of go around this decision making.
If you were a CEO shareholder wanting the best for your company, which model would you adopt?
If I was CEO shareholder, I'd be emotionally wed to making sure that I've got the decision before we actually get there. I don't want to be surprised when I get to the meeting. So I probably would want that. But as I say, I don't think one is better than the other. You can get better discussion when everybody's coming into the room feeling like they're solving the problem together and you're not individually gathering your evidence as you go along. So it can work both ways.
Can we zoom out and look at this through your lens now as an expert FGS Global, where you're at the intersection of public perception, media, and corporate strategy? My own experience of communications crises is that they are like wildfires and you have to cut off the oxygen if you can because you have limited control over the fires. Really interested to hear how you approach that as an advisor and what are the frameworks that you use to help boards think about those strategic communications and crisis management?
Yeah. So that's a really good question, because what's common is by the time the board has called you about a crisis, it's probably a little late because it's already on the front page. So building a framework at that particular juncture is going to be a little bit difficult. What's best and what works best is when we've actually gotten into the board earlier. We already have that relationship that's in place. So I head up our board services practice, and we're constantly thinking about this because the board's role and the exec's role are different when you're going into a crisis, depending on the nature of it. And the one thing that's hard to do as a board is to really get a good assessment of the vulnerabilities ahead of time. And that's the thing that you need to have in your risk management process early, and not just the technical risk that you might get from the IT team and the cyber team, but also thinking about what the reputational risks might be that are going into it. And then saying, okay, well, how would this rise up to me at a board level? What's actually going to get pushed into a potential AGM or EGM vote? And how will that impact me either individually or us as a group going forward? Something may not have actually been on our risk register, but it happened to one of our peers. Do we need to now bring that into the risk register? Because I have somebody who's not just internally looking at things, but actually looking across the piece about what the trends are. And that's one of the things that we bringing in data from elsewhere to understand what's actually swaying AGM votes or what's actually swaying trends of what's coming up in the boardroom. And then also having a good escalation protocol. That's the other place where I think things start to break down is something happens in the bowels of an organization. And by the time the board finds out about it, 2 weeks have passed. And when they could have helped and they could have helped management triage a decision, it's already too late. So I think those are the types of things that you want to work with the board on. Management should feel like they can come to the board with the problem and they're not going to get the hand slapped because it's come up, and that somebody's going to be constructive with them in that boardroom and helping them get through it.
Yeah, I think always, both as an executive and a board, you always want to hear about bad news quickly. And often, as many people have commented on, the reverse is true. You hear about the good news quickly and the bad news gets buried. What have you seen organizations who've managed to make that happen in the right way? What is it that a board member listening should have on their checklist that their organization is doing?
So I think there's some common mistakes I see. We take too long to make the hard calls. So, the hardest call that you have to make as a board is changing management. And sometimes that can take too long for people to do. You never really want to do it because you want to back your management team because, bad things can happen to anyone. But if you take too long to make the hard call, that's difficult. Other things that are a little bit less close to home. Do you disclose the cyber breach and when? Do you apologize for a mistake that may or may not have been on your watch, but you are now culpable for because your name was on the door? Do you push management to get you involved in the decision making just a little bit earlier? You've seen the headline come up, but management still hasn't come to you. Do you push them to say, look, we need to have a meeting and we need to talk about this and we need to try to come up with a solution together and co-create that?
But what are the organizations who are managing to surface that bad news quickly doing to make that happen? Aside from building trust, are there processes, documentation, activities that they have done that organizations who don't get that bad news coming out quickly have failed to do?
I think most of those people actually have a crisis management process in place. And some organizations, they have it, by statute because they're in high risk, capital intensive organizations where, explosions can happen and they're able to surface things because there's a nominated director on the board who gets called as soon as something happens. People who are non-regulated industries could probably learn a lot from that and having a process where there is somebody who says, okay, there's a cyber breach. We call them immediately. And that person is actually either got specialist expertise on the board and so they can actually help us work through it, or, they're able to assemble a committee so that we can go look at the problem very quickly. But that's really about having that process in place early so that you actually know how to do that escalation protocol.
I suppose that works well when you have known unknowns, crises that you can identify, like a cyber breach. You can have a clear policy. If this happens, then, it gets elevated to the board. Yeah. Where I suppose it's more challenging is when it's something you're encountering for the first time that people haven't anticipated. What can boards do to ensure that their communication from the executive team is better?
So some of that comes up in your non-financial risks, as we would call it in the corporate affairs space. So they won't come up in your audit committee, but when the corporate affairs director is coming to you, or the corporate affairs advisor, if you don't have one of those, is coming to you, they'll be able to tell you these are the types of things that we're seeing going on that are actually threatening the reputations of business. And we should be talking about those on a regular basis. A corporate affairs director in a business should be reporting on a regular basis on what's going on around the industry, the sector, wider society, and keeping people smart. So that's one of the things that we had on one of our boards. We have people come in to talk to us about things that aren't necessarily burning issues right now for us, but are burning issues elsewhere. And that helps keep the board smart about how they should be thinking about problems, because that's what we do all day. We're just thinking about how to solve problems. It isn't necessarily just trying to solve the immediate crisis.
Okay. Can we run with an example? I was fascinated in episode 35 when Dimitri Chichlo touched on the risk of deepfakes, which could be used to start a run on a bank by impersonating the head of the bank and getting them to insinuate there is a shortage of cash, which could kill a bank very quickly. What can boards do to prepare against these sorts of risks where it feels like the scale and the speed at which communications is moving now makes it almost impossible?
The first thing is about educating the wider team. So most of the time when things like this come up, it's somebody who wouldn't suspect that they're a target. So if the teams don't know what to look for, it's almost impossible 18 levels above for you to figure out that something's happened or something's going to happen. So making sure that people understand fraud and AI and deep fakes all the way down to the bottom levels of the organization for the person who's holding the keys to important data but doesn't know they actually have the keys. Having early warning systems in place. And a lot of that is a technical detail that you need to work on with your teams on how you create that escalation protocol to say, okay, this manipulation of data or this transaction doesn't look like it's in line with our past patterns. How do we actually get on top of this and just double check that it's not an anomaly? Building up organizational resilience. So mapping vulnerabilities around the organization. So they may not be the direct cyber risk that you think about. It's not something that Darktrace is going to pick up, but it is something that is a vulnerability that you can see in an organization that if somebody caught on, they probably could pen test, as you mentioned in that episode, and they could get in and probably get to data that's pretty precious to you. I think the other thing is thinking about how you inoculate against things that are happening. There was an example I read in The Guardian last week where I saw some poor man in Georgia. He had someone who looked like his financial advisor calling him over 6 months or a year's time frame, continuously telling him to make investments. Now, it's a deep fake. He didn't know that he wasn't actually talking to his FA, and he lost a year's salary to that. When you see things like that are actually happening, you should be getting out to your customers, to your employees, and actually showing them this is what it could look like. This is what you should be looking out for so that you're getting out in front of the story before it starts to snowball.
You mentioned there often the problem is organizations don't realize they might be the target of this sort of thing. There are some examples that you can share.
So I could be a B2B organization, and I'm not going to say the name of this particular one, but it's always a financial risk that you're really looking at. And this particular organization had the CEO calling the CFO to make a transaction on behalf of the organization, and then nearly made a very large 7-figure sum trade. Now, had the CFO not picked up the phone and called someone, they wouldn't have caught it, and they would have just gone ahead and said, oh, I've cleared this transaction. And, but they looked at the bank account numbers and said, actually, this doesn't quite look familiar. But you could very easily say, oh, well, it's just a different bank account and it was the CEO. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. But they had protocols in place to make sure that there was some way of catching and verifying what was going on. That was luck, though. You very easily could have gone the other way.
The other major comms challenge that it strikes me many organizations are wrestling with at the moment are those brought about by some of the geopolitical shifts. Mm-hmm. So there are many organizations right now pivoting on their D&I positions and repositioning them in some cases as L&D initiatives, while others are backtracking altogether. Mm-hmm. We're both Goldman alumni. There was an interesting announcement they made when they shared that they were stepping back from their board diversity IPO pledge to have at least 2 underrepresented board members, including at least 1 woman on any company they IPO, which they say has now served its purpose, which didn't feel like it was a winning communications strategy. How would you have advocated navigating that had you been on the board?
So I've got my personal view, which I'll keep to myself, and my communications professional view. It wasn't the greatest moment or the greatest quote to have on that particular issue. But if we take a step back and look at the legal landscape, NASDAQ had already been forced to change its rules. So I wasn't surprised to see that Goldman changed its rule because it was likely going to be forced to do so in a court of law very soon. So if you know that's the case, then it's all about how do you position it and whether or not you actually had any conviction around it at all. You could say we're going to stop doing this because the legal landscape has changed. However, we still believe in the principle that diverse boards are actually more productive, make better decisions, in the long term generate more value. And therefore, we're going to support in these other ways. We're going to make sure that people within our network are placed in front of recruiters, placed in front of other boards, making sure that we are contributing to the ecosystem of board diversity, not necessarily by making it a legal requirement. That's one way that I would have advised that they deal with it because Goldman's network is phenomenal. But, those are small things that I think are sitting within a wider legal context that's going to be difficult to navigate for a lot of people. We had a call actually last week or the week before where we had corporate affairs professionals in the UK of businesses that have major holdings and operations in the US. And it was with our US professionals to talk about the DEI landscape, what's changing both legally and in the government, and also what businesses are doing in the US about it and how they're reacting. We surfaced lots of views, but quite a few people came back and said, can we use this tool to scan our website? Because we need to look at the language that we're using because we don't want to be brought under attack, etc. There's a lot that's happening that I think is probably going to bleed across for anybody who's got exposure to the US.
In episode 110, Pamela Dow advocated that boards and CEOs should become more apolitical than perhaps they have been in recent memory. I'm curious to hear, with the rising political scrutiny on businesses, what do you see boards best advised to do in terms of shaping public policy and their position related to it?
So I might be excommunicated from the Corporate Affairs Club for this, but I actually don't think that business is that influential with everyday voters. Most people don't identify with the CEO of a big business. So I do question whether or not people need to get involved in a political sense around things that are going to be voted upon by everyday people. Behind the scenes, talking directly to politicians, I think that is always still valuable because a lot of politicians just aren't exposed to the same amount of information that you might be as a CEOs out in the world. So that's always going to be valuable. And I think a lot of times politicians value that because it's the only way that they're going to get a little bit more information about what's going on. I think the other thing is making sure that you're calling on friends. So it can't just be you. You need to actually have a cohort of people who make up the entire economic system that are actually helping to influence what's going on, but not necessarily taking it all on your back to be able to do it. You know, we had a big swing from the late 2010s into early 2020s of people needing to feel like they have to talk about every single issue. And we can see not just the backlash from that, but actually people got distracted from what they were actually supposed to be doing, which was the actual commercial purposes of their business. And I do think there is a level set that we need to have and go back to some more traditional channels of negotiation.
I guess one of the reasons people went down that path was they said that our employees are not accepting us not having a position on this. So it's one thing to say, let's avoid the scrutiny from government and the sort of political end of the spectrum, but you've still got your internal stakeholders to deal with as well as your customers.
It's I'm not saying that's an easy one. I do think that you need to have a stance internally because the culture of your organization depends on it and the motivation of your employees depends on it. You probably also need to talk to them a little bit more about what are the avenues that you are using if it isn't going to be across the side of a billboard or isn't it going to be across all of your social media channels, so to speak. So I think having more of a dialogue with your employees around what the corporate stance is and how the company actually makes decisions is probably going to be more important in order to help with ameliorate that when we're not going to be out in the front lines all the time, actually kind of pushing for things that actually have nothing to do with the day-to-day of the business. The other thing is, I think we, in a polarized society, taking one side alienates 50% of your consumers. And you see that with a lot of businesses who are having mass shifts and mass boycotts. Those who actually were a little bit more down the middle of the road have been a lot safer in terms of having steady revenues, not as many attacks from either side of an argument.
I guess there are examples like Patagonia was the poster child of taking a strong position and saying, well, yeah, we're going to alienate 50% of the market, but we're going to own that other 50%. But it sounds like your sort of advice to an organization as a board member would be more to lean towards that middle ground of not upsetting people rather than trying to really win a smaller part of the market who are passionate about your position.
I think Patagonia probably, when they said they were going to alienate 50%, were probably not alienating 50% of their own customers. It was probably the 50% who didn't patronize them anyway. So you have to know who your customer base is, I think is probably the other thing. Have the data on where people actually land as you make decisions. If you are a niche brand, then you probably have a very specific demographic, and that demographic has a very specific set of opinions. If you're catering to that, then that's fine. But if you are a mass market, I sell bread brand, you're selling to everyone. And I think there's probably a much bigger risk there.
Let's talk about how you've gone about building your portfolio alongside your executive career.
Mm-hmm.
You've talked about your board journey in the past and transitioning from pro bono to paid roles, which is where a lot of people struggle to make that transition. How did you go about that? What do you think you have done to enable you to do that successfully?
For me, it's a bit timing and a bit circumstance. So it's finding an opportunity where the skills that I had were relevant and up to the moment of what was going on. So I got my first paid board role during COVID. So social justice movement aside, there were lots of things going on that really centered around stakeholder engagement because of the nature of what was happening in society, navigating messages around lockdowns. When for Post, which was the board that I joined, we had people working throughout lockdown because the public needs to eat and we have to be able to serve them. So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with the messaging and manage talking to employees and also thinking about public safety? How do you think about mental health through this period? All those sorts of things. And then on top of that, how do we think about brand presence in an age in which people are scrutinizing brands differently? So it was just a very relevant time. Also, I happened to have geography on my side because they also needed someone who was exposed to a new market for them, a relatively new market in which they had acquired Weetabix, which is here in the UK. And so me sitting here, being American, understanding the product, having grown up eating it, but being in the market in which they're expanding happened to work out quite well.
So eat your Weetabix.
Eat your Weetabix. Thank you very much.
You've done both pro bono and paid board roles alongside an executive career. And so for an senior executive listening to this who's thinking about taking on a board role, I'm curious to hear where you feel you've got most value from those for your executive career.
Honestly, I've gotten value from both. I think I'm lucky in the composition of what I've chosen, that I've been strategic about it. It's really about whether or not you think it's going to relate and you're going to be able to both offer something and bring something back. So me choosing to be on the board of which, it's an organization that had a public purpose, spent a lot of time lobbying the government, and I sit in a firm that also advises companies on public affairs. So there was a kind of a symbiotic balance between what it is that I do every day and what the organization did. And so I was learning just as much as I was offering to that particular organization. With Post, I'm thinking more about kind of the commercial side of things, and the way Post runs is very similar to your private equity firm in terms of how it thinks about acquiring businesses and creating efficiencies, etc. And I used to be a banker and also advise on deals as a communications professional. And so even in that balance, there were skill sets and learnings that I could both gain and offer between the two. So for me, it's more about the opportunity itself as opposed to whether or not it's pro bono or paid.
That's really interesting as a way to look at it, because what strikes me is the pro bono roles are much easier to get. They're much less competitive than the paid roles. And so if I take from what you said there and I can find alignment in the pro bono space in a role, then the return on my time invested as an executive is likely to be much higher, because if the value is the same from both, in a sense, if they're aligned, then the effort I have to put in is much lower in that pro bono space. Does that resonate for you?
The effort to get the role, probably yes. I wouldn't say the effort while you're on the board is going to be less. It's probably going to be a lot more.
And maybe it's not so much the effort to get the role, but it's more the probability that you will get the role. So you have to spend commensurately less time getting a pro bono role versus a paid role. Dorothy, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you a brief question and ask you for a quick response if you're ready.
Yep.
First up, best book every board member should read and why?
Picking Presidents by Gautam Mukunda. That's all about how you choose leaders, either through natural filtration systems in an organization or picking the rogue outsider to become the new leader, and the risks and rewards in choosing one or the other. It's the best book for any nomination committee chair.
Boardroom behavior that irritates you most?
Succumbing to the Abilene paradox, where everyone agrees to something that no one individually wants.
Most valuable board ritual?
The carpool moments to and from the meeting where the real discussion happens.
Favorite quote?
Our life is what our thoughts make it, by Marcus Aurelius.
Most significant professional insight?
Pick people over process, because you could have a perfect process, but the wrong leader will tip it over.
Worst professional advice you've ever received?
Be quiet and just play your position.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
That all the wisdom you need can be contained on one board.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
I alluded to this earlier, not speaking up more loudly when I knew a decision was going to be our own goal. I've learned that politeness is not always a winning strategy.
Can you expand on that in the
I
boardroom?
am not advocating impolite. Sometimes when someone's made a recommendation, I find people don't want to offend the CEO by voting them down. And then so they'll let something fly. Sometimes it's for their own good because it may blow up in their face later if you actually block a decision that they seem to really want.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
I'm a lot less anxious about having all the right answers and understand that it's really about surfacing the right discussion to help get there.
And finally, 3 things our listeners should take away from this episode if they take nothing else.
For the communicators, I think they should know that boards need them more than ever. For those who are looking for a role, think beyond the technical skills on your CV and think more broadly about your experience. And then for anyone who's listening, if you're seriously questioning a decision, speak up. I guarantee you someone else in the room has the same misgiving.
I love how you've picked out those different segmented customer profiles. It's a sign of a brilliant communicator. Dorothy, thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.